Well, good afternoon, All Saints. It's great to be with you in virtual form, if not in real form, but hopefully not before long. We will be back in person, meeting together as normal. We're in week 12 of our sermon series, and today I'm going to be talking about Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 45. And so if you haven't read it already, you might want to pause and then go and read the passage and then come back to the video. So I'll give you a chance to do that now if you haven't read the passage already, but otherwise, let's carry on. I want to tell you a story about when I was in high school. We had this changing area where we would all go get changed for PE, and as you could imagine, in a boys' locker room in high school, there's a bit of shenanigans that kind of goes on in there. So one day, this kid, has changed out of his PE gear, but he hasn't quite put on, and I think we'd been swimming actually that day, and so he hasn't quite put on everything. He puts on his undies, and he jumps up on one of the benches. And as he's up there, he starts like parading around, like down the bench, pretending he's the man, chest out, puffed up, showing his arms. This is guns, this is blazers, and he's showing off. He's putting all his energy into it. He's up there probably about 2 minutes in total, and he's just parading around, and the rest of us are sort of, minding our own business. Well, one of the other boys turns around, and he sees him up there, and he just points at him and just starts laughing. And all of us are sitting there going, what is going on? Like, yeah, I get it, like he's being a bit of a dick, but none of us really want to, like, point it out or make sure he's, knows it. And so we just kind of carry on, not thinking anything. But then he bursts out with laughter and says, that guy's got his undies on the wrong way out. And he'd put them on, and the tag is hanging out the back, and you can see clearly that he had them on the wrong way. It was not the greatest moment, but this guy went from hero to zero in about 2 seconds flat. As soon as that said, the whole changing room broke into laughter. It was chaos in there. Things were going on. But the most important thing for me was like, yeah, perhaps if we'd been humble, we wouldn't have actually got in that situation. If you just minded your own business and been over there, no one would have known any the wiser. And I think today, in our reading, Jesus teaches us all that lesson. Jesus is not pretending to be something that he isn't. You'll know that from the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've been talking about the idea that Jesus says again and again to his disciples that I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And of course, this isn't the picture they have of what a Messiah figure should be like. This isn't the picture they have of who he is meant to be. And so they don't quite get it. They're like the blind man that we talked about in the first week. They're just blind to the fact of how this kingdom works. But Jesus is again reminding his disciples that humility is one of the most important things in the kingdom. The funny thing is, after this, 2 disciples come to him. And they come to him and they ask, can we be given the right hand and the left hand of your kingdom? So these were like pride of positions in the stately realm. They were the places that were reserved for special people. They were the places that were the highest honor in the kingdom. And these 2 disciples, 2 brothers, the brothers of thunder they called them, come to Jesus and say, can we be given those positions? And he asks them a question. He says, well, can you drink the cup that I'm about to take? Now, the cup refers to this idea of suffering, or, we know it as he's going to be led into the cross, into the death. So he asks them that question: Can you take the cup that I'm about to take? And they say, yes, of course we can. But I think they're thinking more like, well, okay, we'll suffer a little bit, we'll take that cup, but if it means that we get these glorious places in heaven, then what does it matter? What does it matter that we suffer a little bit and we get given this glorious place? And Jesus, of course, says, well, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or my left is actually not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have already been prepared. Now, it's a bit like my guy in the locker room. The two disciples went to Jesus personally. They kind of cornered him in a corner and they got hold of him and they found him alone and they asked him that question. But when the rest of the disciples found out, man, were they angry. They were super, super upset. They became indignant with James and John. And this again is where Jesus teaches us the second lesson. He teaches us that A, kingdom is about humility. But B, he talks about the fact that whoever wants to be great amongst you must be a servant. And then he points to his own life. Whoever, the Son of Man, me, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus reminds his disciples again that this kingdom is about humility. It's about being a servant, being the least of the least. And that's what you've got to do. Now, I'm an Enneagram 3. And if you don't know what an Enneagram 3 is, it basically means that I'm an achiever. I get a lot of things done, do a lot of things, tick a lot of things off a list. But the reality is I do that to be seen, to look good, to feel proud, to be awesome. When I was at high school, this is a few years later after my other story, prefects become a big thing. In year 12 at my high school, they were a big thing. And you become a prefect of your own kind of mini school within the big school. They called them division. And so year 12s would become the head of that. And then there were year 13 prefects as well. Well, I went along this process. It's a bit like an ordination discernment process. You have interviews, you put in your recommendations, you get voted on by the school. And those that make it to the top are the prefects for the year. So me and my friends were involved in this process. I think there were about 8 of us in total. 7 of them became prefects in my division. I was the only one not to get one of those positions. Now, being an Enneagram 3, I wanted the recognition. I wanted the kind of status. I really looked for the fact that I could be this leader and people would look up to me and go, and I could put it on my CV and people would look at me really proudly and I'd be just this amazing person. But the reality is God taught me a big lesson that day. That day he taught me that actually I've just got to serve. It took me a few years to realize that lesson. It took me a few years to really get it. And I've revisited that painful time in my life again and again through other different things when I haven't been selected for things. But for me, that meant I learnt that lesson of humility. I learnt the lesson that I think Jesus is trying to teach his disciples here, that the whole point of the kingdom, the greatest amongst you, will be the servant. And so that's really the message of this week. Are we living in a humble way? Now, I want to give you kind of 2 ideas of how this might play out in our lives. The first, I think, is that we often want to look for the positions of power. We often look for the fact that we want to be important. We want to be the one who makes the biggest decisions. We want to have all the say. The reality is, actually, the greatest in this kingdom are the servants. Makes me wonder about the church life, the church structure, the church way of doing things. I, along with the 3 other deacons, hold the leadership position in this place. But are we the greatest amongst us? The thing for me is, I don't think we are. And we shouldn't be. Actually, we should just be calling out other people who are also serving in this place. I think of the people who clean our church. I think of the people who do things that don't even get noticed. Those are the people I want to emulate, and I want to be like, and I want to exalt to the highest places. Because that's what the kingdom of God is meant to be like. In fact, you might even notice when we go to a Wednesday service, we dress up in all the white robes. And those white robes are simply the Roman servant costume. What we wear, these things around our necks, these things on our, the stoles, the white garb, all of that stuff is to remind us to be the servant. Remind us that we are not here to serve, but to be served, but we are here to serve. As clergy, we need to be reminded of this, because although we hold the leadership position, we are called to be servants amongst us. The second thing I think this applies to is the fact that Jesus basically implies to the brothers that they have to pick up the cup. They have to be baptized by the baptism that Jesus is baptized by. His disciples, to be disciples, the calling that they have received is to follow in Jesus' footsteps. And so what does that mean for us? As disciples, as followers of Jesus, how do we follow in Jesus' footsteps? The calling is big. And the offer of positions or ranking or hierarchy is not necessarily there. We have the promise of eternal life. That is the promise. But the calling is to be like Jesus. So that might mean we suffer. That might mean we don't get the recognition we deserve. That might mean we have to lay down our desires, our wants, our things at the foot of the cross and say, Jesus, this is not about me any longer. This is not about my rights. In fact, the whole thing says, actually, Jesus came to give his life as a ransom, to pay a fee, to get some people out of slavery. And I think the slavery that we find ourselves in is that continual rat race that we run. To be the best, to be the biggest, to have the most money, to be this amazing person in society. And as long as we're still continuing in that rat race, the ransom, the slavery, what Jesus came to do has not been done. He wants to get us out of that, pull us out of the way of the world and pull us into this kingdom. And what's this kingdom about? Service and humility. And so how are we serving this week? How are we being humble? How are we giving up our rights and responsibilities and pointing instead to the people who serve? I think that's a big challenge, and it's something that we must live into as the people of All Saints. As we come out of lockdown, as we head potentially towards level 2, how can we serve those that are continuing to serve? How can we serve those that don't necessarily get the highest positions in our society? How do we as a church respond in loving service and give our life away as a ransom for others? That's the challenge. That's the call. That's what Jesus is trying to redefine. And as we end this part of Mark's Gospel, the second act of Mark's Gospel, do we now get it? That Jesus gave up everything in order to save us. Our only response is, how do we follow that call? Let me pray. Lord, I just thank you so much that we can know you, that we can understand what your kingdom is like. And Lord, help us every day to remember to be humble, to remember to follow you, and to remember that you are the first amongst us. You go before us, you show us the way. Help us to follow in those footsteps. Amen.